topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program. Thanks for tuning in again this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, joining you live from Dallas, which is home base for me. If we've not met yet and you don't know me, I'm a management consultant, organizational logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I help companies to articulate their purpose and build inspirational leaders and cultures activated by meaning and purpose to turn those companies from a flatline EKG to a vibrant workforce. Here, people are intrinsically motivated to perform at their best, grow into their fullest potential, and want to stick around in such a gratifying workplace. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at elisecortez.com. Also, if you like the content of the show and the guests I bring on, you may also be interested in my next book coming out in March 2023. It's called The Great Revitalization, How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. You can pre-order at Amazon or Barnes & Noble. Now, with us today is Dr. Michael Glauser. He's an entrepreneur, business consultant, and university professor. Today, he serves as executive director of the Center for Entrepreneurship in the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University. He's also the director of the Seed Self-Sufficiency Program, helping people around the world to improve their standard of living and benefit their communities through entrepreneurship. He is the author of One People, One Planet, 6 Universal Truths for Being Happy Together, which we'll be talking about today. He joins us today from Salt Lake City, Utah. Dr. Glauser, welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you, Elise. I'm happy to have a conversation with you today.
Well, I really appreciate having wicked smart people on the show who really care about making the world a better place. So hearty welcome. And with it, you did that and that's just one of your books in it, but this beautiful book you put out here, One People, One Planet. Of course, I read it cover to cover. Beautiful work and such a contribution, Michael. It's so beautiful.
Well, thank you. I'm impressed that you read it.
Yeah, I hear that a lot from my guests. Apparently, it's a thing. Yeah, I am. Apparently, hosts don't like to read books, but I do. So, somebody actually once said, "Elise, you're a radio show host with a reading problem." It's true. Well, you've got a few books out. You've got an interesting background here, Michael. Lots of things that you've done. I think it will be helpful for our guests and viewers to be able to hear just a little bit about your background. And then I have to know where this book came from.
Okay, great. So I've been a university professor part of my career. I've been an entrepreneur a good part of my career. I built 6 companies and sold those companies. And I'm a business strategy consultant. So I help organizations figure out what their purpose is and help them create a strategy to achieve that purpose. And so I think we have a lot in common.
I think we do too. Actually, Joanne said to me, she said, this is your publicist for those who don't know who Joanne is, but we do. She said, "Oh, you're going to like Michael. You guys have so much in common. It'll be easy." And I think she's right. So it's interesting here on the eve, Michael. I'm going to be, I helped put together a diversity, equity, and inclusion conference tomorrow. And I'm going to be also speaking on belonging tomorrow. So I think it's interesting that we're talking about this conversation here tonight. And to that end, one of the things that I thought was really interesting about how you position what you're talking about in the book is you say, and I'll read it for our listeners and viewers, you say, "We live in a world that emphasizes differences between people, groups, races, religions, and nations. This fixation on differences has a purpose. It helps us understand our world, where we fit in, and how we behave around certain groups. However, a constant diet of differences can lead to distrust, separation, conflict, and marginalizing whole groups of people." That's really profound and important to open this conversation with. So if we can build on that, And maybe just if we can situate a few examples of recent events that really showcase why that's a problem.
Yeah, I really wrote the book because of two epidemics I've seen in my work. I work with college students, I work with entrepreneurs, as I mentioned, I work with a lot of corporate executives, and we're experiencing what I call an epidemic of despair right now that I see in organizations.
Wow.
Anxiety, depression, loneliness, thoughts of suicide, actual suicides, unfortunately, are up in every single age group, every demographic. In the United States right now, 21% of all adults are suffering from some type of diagnosable emotional illness. And so if you have an organization, say 1,000 people, 200 plus of those could be suffering from some kind of emotional challenge. And the research shows that has a huge impact on their satisfaction, their commitment, their performance can be 35% lower if you're struggling emotionally, medical costs, absenteeism, and so on. The second epidemic is what I call an epidemic of incivility, and there's just more hatred in the world right now. And a lot of experts say it's due to social media and the way we interact. It's easy to hate from a distance. It's harder to hate up close. And there has been quite a bit of research lately. One study shows 90% of us have seen an uncivil act at work, and 50% of the respondents in this survey say they see one every single week. And a study across 17 industries show that if you are having incivil acts in your organization, that 67% of the people say they're less committed to the organization, their performance drops. And one really staggering statistics, about 25% of people that are in uncivil organizations take that out on the customer. So it has these two epidemics of despair and incivility just have a huge impact on the culture of an organization. And as you know, we know the culture of the organization is the biggest predictor of the four outcomes of recruiting, retention, satisfaction, and performance. And so I thought it was time to really take a look at, happiness and civility. And that's what led to the book, the research behind the book.
Oh, I so applaud this, Michael. Now let's give a shout out to a friend and colleague of mine in Australia, Philip Roberts. He's very interested in working on this notion of civility as well. So he'll be glad very much to hear about your work and your book. Yeah, so this thing about civility is really interesting. And I really appreciate the work that you're doing. And as I read your book, Michael, I felt like I was in the presence of something of a minister, one part minister, one part mystic, one part world explorer. It was wonderful. That's how I experienced you. That's how you occurred for me.
Great. Yeah, as you know from looking at the book, I wanted to look at some real credible sources on happiness and civility. So what has been written and what do we know about how human beings can be happy personally and live in more civil communities? And so I looked at those, three sources. I went to the original writings of the great religious founders, so the original texts. I didn't look at all the divisions and the fighting and the squabbling between religions. I looked at what did the founders write about happiness and civility. And then I went to the philosophers, the Asian, the Greek, the Roman philosophers. What did they write about happiness and civility? And then to give it credibility in our modern world, I went to science, all the research for 20 years in positive psychology to see if what's been taught for 5,000 years has been vetted through research. And of course, it has been. And so the practices that I outline for happiness and civility come from those three sources.
And I definitely wanted to applaud you on that, Michael, because I really have tremendous respect for people who are savvy in various kinds of religions, not just their own, but and they draw wisdom from other religions. A great example of that is my friend and colleague, Dr. Arthur Cyr McCauley, who's been on this show 4 times because he keeps writing fantastic new books. He also wrote the foreword to my book called Coloring Memoir, which is a memoir about loss. But, he's a man who can easily, with fluidity, move between the religions and say, well, Muhammad might say this, Jesus Christ said this, and such and such. And it's so beautiful. And what I love about that, going back to unity, bringing us together, what do we actually, there's more in common among people than there is not, which you also illustrate beautifully, and I want to cover too. But I really wanted to give you a shout out for that level, that breadth of reach to pull from, religions, from philosophy, from science. I just really thought that was really remarkable.
Well, I tell the story in the book. This was quite a few years ago. I had the opportunity to go work in the Middle East, and I worked in Saudi Arabia at the King's University of Petroleum and Minerals. And they made it clear that, hey, if you talk about politics, you're going to get fired. And if you talk about religion, you're going to get fired. I said, no problem. And then they all started asking me questions about religion. And I kept saying, hey, I can't talk about it. I can't talk about it. And
Right.
well, you can't tell us about yours, but we can tell you about ours. And I essentially went through a 2-year training program in Islamic studies. I had a whole library of Islamic literature, read the Quran. I had copies in Arabic and English, which I was studying Arabic at the time. And I was amazed that the writings of Muhammad on happiness and civility were almost identical to the writings of Jesus on happiness and civility. And that, there are a lot of mysteries about, did we live before we were born, and will we live after? And is there a heaven and hell? And what's the nature of God? But if you look at what they said about, here's how you be happy on the earth, here's how you have civil relationships, all of these great religious founders, as well as the philosophers, were teaching almost identical principles for us to have a better experience on this earth. And that was fascinating to me.
It is fascinating, and I love how you talk about that in your book, that experience of just what you shared right there on air, and that really brings us to, gosh, what if more people really understood that? So to me, Michael, that's about removing a bit of the veil of ignorance among all of us, right? Of whatever faith that we are steeped in, to start to be curious about other faiths, and you give some great examples, which we'll talk about later when we get into the universal truths of how we can discover them. But I just really want to encourage our listeners and viewers. Those many people that listen to this show, Michael, they're interested in elevating their consciousness. They're interested in becoming greater inspirational leaders. And so that is a fantastic thing for them to aspire for, what you just taught us right there.
Well, happiness has been linked to success. In the past, we thought if we can just be successful in our work, if we can get promoted and get pay raises and have a nice salary, a nice home and cars and so on, we're going to be happy. But the latest research shows that just the opposite is the case, that those successes in the world, particularly in our careers, don't lead to happiness. But if we learn to manage our happiness and figure out how to be joyful, that's what drives these successes, these success activities. And people that are happy at work have more friends, they have better relationships, they're more inclined to be leaders, emerging leaders and formal leaders, they get promotions. Happiness just has a huge impact on organizations and teams in organizations. And so this was really important to me as I try to build companies and help others build companies that are really satisfying places to work. This concept of learning to manage our happiness and helping to manage the happiness of our teams becomes really critical for a modern leader. And so these principles, they work in real time. They've been proven. If we practice them, they make a huge difference in our lives and in the lives of our teams.
Beautiful, Michael. So before we go on to our first break here, I want to situate. So we've been talking a bit about, the problem with focusing on the sharp differences. And then you're now helping us understand how many of the philosophies and the religions of the world really overlap. And so then you go on to say, and this is really, really compelling. You then say, and I quote, "We share far more similarities as humans than we do differences. We have common physical attributes. We share 99% of the same DNA, and we have similar emotions and aspirations for ourselves and our loved ones." So focusing on similarities does not mean we are naive about differences among us, but it produces far more positive outcomes in our lives. It helps us to eliminate our biases, develop deeper friendships, collaborate on challenges, and create stronger unity in our communities. We are one people, one planet. We are in this life together. That is so beautiful.
Well, thank you. That was my attempt to show that we have more in common than we have differences. And, a lot of people are bailing out of organized religion, especially the younger generation. And it's not real palatable to them. But I thought, well, let's add philosophy and then add science, and it gives it some credibility. So they say, hey, maybe some of these religious writers were pretty awesome, and the philosophers were pretty cool, and science makes it real for me. So I'm going to start practicing these concepts.
Well, that's called getting them from all sides, Michael. So if one doesn't work, you try this lever over here. I like it, right? That's a full balanced meal right there. And with that, let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We run here with Dr. Michael Glauser, who's the author of One People, One Planet, 6 Universal Truths for Being Happy Together. We've been talking a bit about the importance of understanding how differences can divide us, and there are far more similarities, and the work that he's been doing to really ground his book in philosophy, religion, and science. After the break, we're going to start getting into all 6 of the universal truths. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to the program. I'd like to invite you, before we get back into the program, to check out my first book that I wrote. It's called Purpose Ignited, and I really wrote it to awaken readers to their passion and purpose and start them down the path of becoming an inspirational leader. So I hope you'll check that out as kind of a preference of what this show is all about. If you are just now joining the program, my guest is Dr. Michael Glauser, who, among many other things, serves as the executive director of the Center for Entrepreneurship in the John M. Huntsman School of Business at Utah State University. He's also the author of One People, One Planet, 6 Universal Truths for Being Happy Together. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So before we get into the 6 universal truths that comprise the basis of your book, Michael, I just thought for a second, we're talking about one planet, one people, one planet here. And I really thought that when the pandemic hit, that we had really started to head that direction. I felt to me like, gosh, we really are in this together. But maybe that isn't true so much still. Maybe maybe we glimpsed it, or maybe it was just a joke. They were just kidding. What do you think?
Yeah, all the experts we've interviewed agree, that happiness and civility, they're complex topics, but they all agree that social media has had a huge impact on how we interact. So we're more connected to people than ever before, but it's a superficial connection. And we're also more isolated than we've ever been. And people don't do well. Human beings, we don't do well alone. We don't do well in isolation. And so the social media was starting to isolate us more and more. And then the pandemic made that even worse. I just saw a study by the Gallup organization. When the pandemic started in 2020, only 48% of people in America said they were happy and satisfied in life. And now, 2 years later, 2+ years later, that number's down to 38%. So 38% say that they're happy and satisfied. And I think it's this just continued new world where we don't go to lunch with our friends. We don't go out and do things in the evenings. We don't have long conversations. We don't balance out each other's thinking. We don't help each other when we're starting to struggle. It's all superficial interaction. And it's not that, that really group of core friends that we spend a lot of time with, friends and family. And so the research shows that we're less happy now after the pandemic, and that we're more isolated now. And so, the subtitle of the book, 6 Universal Truths for Being Happy Together, was really important, because if you look at a lot of the books on happiness, some of the best-selling books, they're pretty insular. They look inward. They say, set goals for yourself, get control of your morning, accomplish one big thing each day, get in physical shape. But my research and everything I've read shows that the highest level of happiness occurs in the context of relationships. So we have to learn to do relationships well and have them be meaningful and have them be satisfying, learn to navigate our differences. And so the book really introduces principles that help us do that, help us be happier together.
Very powerful, very, very powerful. And we align as a logotherapist, of course. What I subscribe to is that for us to be happy, we need to be serving other people. So there's still that relational element. And I think you say this in the book too, that it's not just about giving money. If you're going to help people, be out there helping them. You got to be connected to people that you're serving. So you and I do have a lot of alignment together. Joanne is right. And what I did want to do here, Michael, is I wanted just to dive in just briefly on all 6 of the universal truths. Of course, we can't treat them all deeply because you wrote a whole book about that. But the first one seems pretty obvious, but there's a lot to it, and that's give up the ego. Tell us about that.
Yeah, in modern times, we've used the term ego to refer to someone that's really proud, really full of themselves, really cocky. But all the writings throughout philosophy and religion define the ego as a composite of all of our self-perceptions. It's who you think you are. It's who we think we are.
Mhm.
And the Hindus and the Buddhists particularly talk about it being an illusion or a fabrication. So we get all these messages when we're young from parents and from friends and from teachers about who we are. Are we tall or short or thick or thin or attractive or unattractive or athletic or uncoordinated? And we develop these perceptions at a pretty early age, and they set bounds and limitations on what we will and will not do in life. And so the first thing we have to do is realize that these feelings I have about myself are not real. They're perceptions that have developed through interaction with others, and that I really can be more than that. I'm a work in progress, and I can be more and I can do more. And when we look at ourselves as works in progress and other people as works in progress, it really frees us from a lot of these perceptions. And in the book, I go into a bit of detail on how you change these self-limiting perceptions by, it's all through action. You have to start taking small steps that give you evidence that you are different than what you think you have been. And so that's the first place to start, is looking at who do I think I am, and how is that affecting my life and my career and my relationships and my communication and all of my interaction with other people.
Gosh, we could do a whole show just on that one truth, right? We really could. Okay, powerful. So that's give up the ego. That's the first universal truth. And then we go in, this next one is so important as well, aren't they all? But refrain from judging is the next truth.
Yeah, we develop perceptions of other people in the exact same way we develop perceptions of ourselves. We hear messages about them. We see superficial cues like color and race and ethnicity and political party and religious affiliation. And then because humans are complex and our minds can't process all that complexity, we fill in all the pieces to the puzzle and create a whole personality for people based on these observable, unique, superficial cues. And so we have these images of different groups. And the problem is that limits our desire to interact with those groups. It limits our desire to make friends with those groups. And it limits our happiness and our joy in relationships as we're making these judgments. One interesting study that I saw at the time of the last election, or the 2020 election, I guess it was the 2016 election, 78% of Democratic voters said they would never interact or make friends or date or be with anyone that voted for Donald Trump. And it was not quite as high. It was like 58% of Republicans said they would never interact with anyone that voted for Hillary Clinton. So we take something like who you voted for and what is your political philosophy, and we rule out half the world as not being worthy of our interaction and our friendship. And so what happens is we interact up close. We start realizing that we are more alike than we are different. And one of the great stories I tell in the book is about R. Cooper, who you've read the story. He grew up in the gangs in Chicago, and they all had a hatred for each other. And then they started rowing together on a rowing team and realized that they'd all been through trauma. They were all very similar. Their hatred had come from what they had heard about each other, not from any interaction with each other. And they became such good friends, they thought, if it works for rival gangs, let's go do it with the Chicago Police Department. And so they got some, big white cops from Chicago to join their rowing team, and the same thing happened. They really started liking each other. And Arshay always says, it's easy to hate from a distance. It's harder to hate up close. And so overcoming this tendency to judge, it just opens up the whole world to us for new friends and new interaction and new acquaintances and new ways to learn.
Mm-hmm. So beautiful. It's such a powerful example too, Michael. And I think one that I wanted to make sure too, and then talk about one of the things that contributes to judging, of course, is this little thing we tend to do, and that's to exercise our biases. And I thought that you've got like 6 of these different ideas that you put forth on how we can start to work on overcoming or reducing our biases. And I wanted to just talk about a few of them because I think they're really actionable for our listeners and viewers. So one of them is that you put forth is just to learn about different faiths, just like you did in writing the book, and visiting their places of worship. Wow. I have a friend who has done that, where I think he was brought up as a Protestant, and he would go and see what the Baptists were doing. And then he'd go and see what the Methodists were doing. And I thought that was so great, so powerful. Not just that one set of faiths, but at least he stepped out.
Yeah, just to spend a few months and on the weekend go to visit some place of worship is an amazing experience. You realize that they're very kind, loving people, that they are concerned, that you're very welcome, and you just learn more about what they believe, and you realize that this is reasonable. And so for me to meet with some Buddhist priests, I went to different Buddhist temples, and I finally found one that was willing to be interviewed for the book. And she said, yeah, come by next Tuesday. And then she thought, I'm maybe not as qualified. And she actually flew in a Buddhist priest from Houston just to be interviewed by me for the book and for our training programs.
Wow.
The Islamic imam that I met was just an incredible person. And so I think that's a good experience to just see that people that have different beliefs aren't really weirdos. They're not way out there and strange, that they're human beings like we are.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree. And then I kind of want to combine a couple of these other ones that you say here: learn a foreign language and study countries where it is spoken. And then you also say visit different countries and live like the locals, not the tourists. So one of my reason that I speak 5 languages, including English, is I like when I travel to connect with people. And then I can have a real conversation with them and learn about their cultures and what do they prize, what do they cherish. And I love that because it expands my mind, expands my world. I love that.
Yeah, in our SEED program, it's SEED, stands for Small Enterprise Education and Development. It's a worldwide training program where we work with people all over the world that live in poverty. And I have 100 students out that we train to teach entrepreneurship and small business development skills. And we get to live in their neighborhoods, and we get to go into their homes with dirt floors and tin roofs. And we watch their household income grow from $200 a month to $400 or $500 a month. And then they become some of the most generous givers that we've ever met. And it's just a fabulous experience versus, going on a cruise boat and docking and seeing the tourist shops and so on.
Right.
And learning languages, you learn a lot about concepts through language that are different than our concepts.
Mm-hmm. So I always think about language as being another operating system for your brain. You're adding an operating system every time you can speak or interact in any foreign language, and that's really powerful.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
So something else you're going to say?
Just I think the key is you got to be with other people. You got to withhold judgment, and you got to get close to people and do things together, and you'll develop more friendships. You'll shed your biases, and that leads to greater happiness.
Sounds good to me, Michael. Okay, so we've covered give up the ego as one of the universal truths, refrain from judging. Now I want to talk about the third one, do good deeds daily. Talk about that one, if you would, please.
So this is probably the best medicine of all. All of these work in real time. If we go out and do these today, we'll be happier today. And if we do them over a longer period of time, they become a more permanent part of our character. But this is the one that you get the biggest bang for today. I've got my students right now at the university. They're doing 3 good deeds a day for 7 days. And then they write in their journal what happened and who they helped and how they felt. And they're just coming back to class glowing, saying, I had the best week I've ever had. That really what happens is if we get up in the morning and we think, me all day long, we look in the mirror. How do I look? Am I wearing the right clothes? Did I say the right things? How am I going to act today with this person? When we think about ourselves that excessively, we bring all the emotions of being human back into our lives, anxiety and depression and nervousness. But if we get up and say, I'm not perfect, I'm a work in progress, but I can add value. I'm going to go out and find some people to do some good for. And you have that, on your radar all day long, and then you act on it. You will have a much better day. We can actually measure brainwave activity. There's less cortisol, less adrenaline, more of the feel-good chemicals. So it changes your mindset and then over time it changes your physiology as well. So that's one of the big ones.
Well, I'll say that I have this. I always like to say that one of my favorite things to do is practice random acts of kindness, and I do it on a daily basis. So my daughter, who's now almost 20, she's learned over the years. When we go to the grocery store, she's like, "Okay, who is it going to be?" Right. So my favorite thing is to either tell a woman that she's beautiful because she's almost always blown back by that, and she walks away taller. I feel great because I have given her something. So it's that virtuous cycle that you talk about there of kindness. And I love to point out when anyone, man or woman, does something good for other people. And I like to say that I saw what you did. That was really beautiful. And to your point, completely lifts my day. I know I get way more out of that than they do.
We have corporate executives do this as well in our training programs. And the students, and they always are a little nervous, like, oh, I'm so busy. How am I going to find time? And then they realize it's not that big a deal to be nice and to do random acts. You don't have to plan big things. You just have to have an other orientation rather than a self orientation, and then not be afraid to act and, quit thinking of ourselves. I always say, don't worry so much about what people think of us. We worry about what we think of them, and try to be kind and try to, help. And I work with millionaires and billionaires, and everybody has needs. People that are successful and have wealth don't have fewer needs. Everyone has needs. It's not hard to find people that we can serve and do something for every day.
It's so true. And then I wanted to connect this back over as we did before. You say in your book that when person A helps person B, person A gets better. And so that from the logotherapeutic vantage point, that really speaks to what we call self-transcendence. And that we as humans are at our best when we're actually serving other people, not when we're consuming life, but when we're actually serving other people. So I really, really just jam on that particular truth of doing good deeds daily. Be of service, matter.
Yeah. And that statement, when person A helps person B, person A gets better, came from an incredible woman, Mimi Silbert, who's the founder of Delancey Street in San Francisco.
Yes.
One of the most successful rehabilitation programs in the world for convicted felons. And we now have a similar branch of that organization in Salt Lake City, Utah, that I've had the privilege to work with. But, that is their therapy, is we're going to get up and we're going to heal ourselves by helping to heal other people. And it's just an amazing organization. Their therapy is serving others through creating businesses and giving the best service of anyone in the industry. And that's exactly what they do. That's
so powerful, so essential as well. So listeners and viewers, if you would just think on that last truth we were covering here, let's grab our last break here. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Dr. Michael Glauser, who's the author of One People, One Planet, 6 Universal Truths for Being Happy Together. We've been talking a bit about some of the universal truths. After the break, we're going to finish the other 3. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. It occurs to me, here we are talking about one people, one planet. One other thing I do want to share with you is that the anthology that I created, which is called Passionately Striving and Why, has been out for a while. What I did there was I found and I recruited 25 women from all over the world to share their very intimate stories of how they found their purpose and are now serving from it. And I wanted to showcase that purpose is available to anyone, anywhere, regardless of religion, creed, economic situation, whatever, and that we all have that in common. We all want to work from our purpose. So you can check that one out as well. If you are just joining the program today, my guest is Dr. Michael Glauser, who among other things serves as the director of the SEED Self-Sufficiency Program, helping people around the world to improve their standard of living and benefit their communities through entrepreneurship, which is what he's been talking about before in the last segment. He's the author of One People, One Planet, 6 Universal Truths for Being Happy Together. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. So the next truth that we can talk about here is forgiving one another. Ooh, this is tough. You're serving up the hard stuff, Michael.
This is the hardest one. People tell me that read my book and that enter our programs. Yeah, there's so much research on this that if we hold grudges and we're angry, it only hurts us. It doesn't hurt the person we're angry with. It's like a poison. I say it's like drinking poison, and then we sit back and wait for that other person to die. It just affects us emotionally, and it affects us physically. And, one professor at the University of Wisconsin has done over 100 studies on forgiveness. And if we can learn to shed these hard feelings and not to have them in the first place, we're so much healthier and so much happier emotionally and physically. And the great story I love from the Buddha, he talks about 3 types of people that hold grudges. He said the first one's like a line etched in stone. It lasts for a long, long time. The second type of person is like a line etched in the dirt. It stays around for a while, but it eventually dissipates. And the third and the happiest person is like a line etched in water. It almost immediately goes away. And the key is to not take offense in the first place. And that's hard to do. But when we look at ourselves as a work in progress, that we make lots of mistakes. I did some things yesterday that I'm not going to do today. And if we allow other people the privilege of changing and knowing that they can be different tomorrow, maybe not till next year or the year after, but we're not permanently fixated in any kind of personality or character. And if we allow people to change and we don't take offense, we're just much, much happier. The evidence is so clear about this. And the story that I tell in the book, the most powerful one, is about Cy Snar, whose son was shot and killed when he was 18. And she just talks about living in complete depression and anxiety and with suicidal thoughts continually for 20 years until she eventually met and forgave the man who shot and killed her son. Yeah. And then she talks about the difference. It was like night and day. It's like heaven and hell. And she just finally realized, she learned that he was suicidal and troubled. He was an immigrant at 19 and he wanted to take his own life, but he was afraid to do it. So he thought, if I commit a horrible crime, then I'll be able to take my life. And that's what he did. And they caught him before he took his own life. And so he got life in prison, and he's just changed dramatically. She says he's an incredible guy that has grown up in leaps and bounds from where he was as a teenager. And they've basically become great friends. And it's changed her life.
There needs to be a movie made about this if there hasn't already, but it's very, very hard for any of us, certainly me. I can't imagine forgiving something like that. However, what it really speaks to for me is just the sheer vastness of human potential, how much there is for us to grow, how much there is for us to expand. And that inspires me.
Yeah, there was actually a podcast called The Letter. I think it was 8 episodes that you can listen to. It was one of the top podcasts in the country this last year. And she, of course, we were able to interview her and film her. But this podcast is her telling that story, basically.
That's one for me. I like to be able to consume those kind of programs that continue to inspire me and lift me. So I'll put that on my list. Thank you, Michael. So if we go on to number 5 here in terms of our universal truths, now we're on to share our good fortune, which you kind of alluded to earlier, but talk about that one if you would.
Yeah, this is really, it's partially related to the good deeds principle, but it's really more about attachment to material possessions. Right. The research is on how attached we become to what we own. And it's interesting that if we really identify ourselves by what we own, we are what we own, then that feeds this fabricated self. It's harder to break away from this ego that has developed, this illusionary self. And again, the research is clear, is that people that are more generous are a lot happier. If you have sufficient for your needs, but then you're willing to share, time and resources and money and talents, you're just a lot happier. You have better relationships. You enjoy the world more. You enjoy people more. It's been interesting. While I was writing the book, we were remodeling our home in Salt Lake City, and we had to move everything out of the home, all of our clothes and our furniture and our appliances. And then when we were through, we started moving it all back in, and we decided, we thought, we don't want all this stuff, Mm-hmm. I gave away probably 70% of my clothes. If I hadn't worn it for a year, I gave it away. And we just gave away things that we weren't using. And we have a really awesome decluttered home right now. And I can't tell you how joyful it is to have so much less clutter and to actually have found people that need some of the things that we were essentially hoarding and not using. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're really attached to things, the research shows that you're more likely to be greedy. You're more likely to have anxiety because you're afraid you're going to lose what you have. And the interesting thing is that your material possessions start losing their value as you cling to them. And so again, we have, people in our courses and our classes spend a few weeks looking at their possessions and saying, what haven't I used and what can I give away and who can I give it to? And it's that personal contact that really changes them as they start becoming more generous and sharing.
You're reminding me, Michael, when I lived in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil for 2 years, 91 to 93, the Brazilians, they taught me so much about life. They taught me a lot about communication, but they also taught me about this very universal truth here: share your good fortune. They would give the shirt off their backs before they had their next meal. That's just how it was. And they were some of the most happy, jovial human beings I'd ever encountered. It was really beautiful. And they didn't have, a lot of them, much of the country at the time, didn't have a lot of material possession, to your point.
Yeah, when you look at the happiness survey that's done every year and the countries are ranked, we in the United States rank pretty low. And the countries that are the highest are countries in Latin America, Ecuador, Costa Rica, and countries that have very little, that have a lot of poverty, but they're so grateful for what they do have, and they're some of the most generous people we work with. It's amazing to us when we'll help a family double their household income over a period of time. And then we watch them start giving things to their neighbors and sharing what they have. It's pretty amazing.
It's so beautiful. I serve on the board of an organization called Namaste Direct, and they are an organization that helps Guatemalan businesswomen with business loans and education to grow their businesses as well. We see the same thing happen with them. It's so, so beautiful. If only we Americans could learn just as well, huh? We can. I know we can. I'm going to hold out faith. Okay, so our last universal truth here, and this is going to dovetail into this: care for our needy.
Yeah, this is, again, a kind of an extension of doing good deeds. With good deeds, you're going out randomly looking for a way to make a difference every day. With this one, we have people in our communities that are really suffering. They have emotional illness. Maybe they've been through a difficult divorce. Maybe they've lost a child. Maybe they've lost a job. And this is a longer term commitment. If each one of us will help one person, it'll make a huge difference in the world. And so I say, look at the skills that we have, the experiences we have, and who are we uniquely qualified to mentor through a difficult time. And if everyone in our community was doing that, we would have incredible, loving communities. And so this is really looking for someone that we may be uniquely qualified to serve over a period of time. And you can get involved in an organization, you can volunteer, at hospitals, aftercare centers, whatever. But if we want to improve our communities and become more civil, we have to take care of the people that are struggling and suffering in our communities. And so that's the last one of the 6.
Yeah. So what that speaks to me, Michael, is really lifting all boats, right? Not just what's great for you. It's so great. You're doing wonderful. Taking a moment to really, look around and lift as you go. To me, that's just, I can see that the thread of the community just lifting and becoming more fortified and strong and connected.
Yeah, and Aristotle had a lot to say. Some of the philosophers, the Greek philosophers, that we really need to lift those that are struggling in our communities up to the middle class, and that preserves the community. If we have a huge gap between wealthy and poor, we don't have a middle class, then we have strife and conflict.
Yes.
But if people in the middle class, they aspire to have greater wealth. So they're not real angry at those that are wealthy, and they've been maybe at the bottom. So they want to help raise people up. And the bigger the middle class, the more civil our societies. And this was thousands of years ago that this was being taught in communities.
Again, I discovered that same phenomenon when I lived in Brazil. Same thing. It was exactly that same thing. And I sought to be able to address that through some of my writings and research too. So really interesting to hear you say that back in stereo with me. Really, really compelling, Michael. Okay, so then if we go on here, you talk about this idea of a happiness plan. So if you could just speak a little bit about, what is a happiness plan? How do we start to maybe create it and maybe start to implement it?
So this is the interesting thing, is that these 6 principles are not new. Everyone's heard about them. The problem is we don't practice them. And so a happiness plan is to actually set some goals in these areas. So you start with, where do I have some limiting self-perceptions where I think I'm not worthy or not good enough? And what are the small steps I could take as evidence that I can get better at that? And so there's something you're working on to improve yourself each day. And then you go into judging. And we recommend that people take the Harvard implicit bias tests, take one every week, and try to find out more about your biases, because a lot of them we don't even know about, and then do something about what you learn. And then good deeds, make a commitment. We have these journals where you write every day something that you do and how it affects the person and how it affects you. And just so start doing that. Commit to do that for 30 days. Forgiveness. Are you holding on to some anger from years back, or even more recent anger towards a family member or a friend or a coworker? And maybe can you go and make that relationship better and let that go? I find the biggest problem people have is not so much forgiving others, but forgiving themselves for mistakes they've made. And so we have some suggestion on how you take those past problems that you've maybe created and you wrap them up in a box and put them on a shelf and move on and forget about them forever. And so really it's more about just doing things. It's about doing the practices. And as I mentioned, they work in real time. Our mission, we're kind of evangelists for happiness and civility.
I'm seeing that.
What we're trying to do is get people to do these things just on a trial basis. And that was what impressed me about the religious writings. The Hindu sages and Buddha and Christ, Muhammad, they all said, hey, don't take our word for this, try it, see what happens. And so that's our request to people is, get a copy of the book, study those 6 things, create a plan to practice them for at least 30 days. We've got a new journal coming out, which is 90 days to a happier, healthier life. So there's 90 days of working on these principles. And what happens then is later in life, when we start sinking into despair and we get a little bit anxious, we remember that, oh yeah, I've quit doing those things. Mm-hmm. And, of course, it's more complicated than that. We have different genes that predispose us to happiness. But these things make our lives better than it would be otherwise. And it's observable to see if we simply practice them. So we got to take action.
Sounds good to me, Michael. So this show is listened to by people around the world, and we are all generally trying to either create workplaces where we actually want to come and give our best, that are civilized. Thank you very much. We can grow into our best, and we are led by inspirational leaders who really bring us into our greatness. We do business that betters the world. What would you like to leave our listeners and viewers with today?
One of the fun things we're seeing is if we have a training program to help organizations implement these things, but it can be way simpler than that. I mean, if people just get a copy of the book and watch some of our videos online and then meet once a week at lunch to talk about them and how they apply to their teams, some amazing things can happen in the workplace.
Sounds good. That sounds amazing to me. And I am going to send them to your website here. So I want to say first, Dr. Glauser, thank you very much for the work that you do in the world, for what you're doing through your books and through your work, and for being on Working on Purpose. It's great to know you.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure getting to know you, Elise.
And you can run from me, but you can't hide. I'm pretty fast on my feet. So now that I know you, you're stuck.
Let's talk again. Let's do it again.
Sounds good. Okay, so listeners, viewers, if you want to learn more about Michael Glauser, his book or his books and the work he does, start by visiting onepeopleoneplanet.com. Lots of good stuff there. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always get to the recorded podcast. We were on the air with Stefan Falk talking about his book, Intrinsic Motivation, Learn to Love Your Work and Succeed as Never Before. He provided some powerful insight about how we can learn to love almost any activity. It was really, really quite amazing. Next week, we'll be on the air with Bill Murphy, who is the author of Thriving in the Storm, 9 Principles to Help Overcome Adversity. He has actually one heck of a story to tell himself about this topic and what he's overcome in his life, and then the principles that he offers that are really quite actionable as a result. See you there, and remember that work is an integral and important part of our lives and can be one of the best adventures and means of realizing our potential and making the impact we crave. So let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.